Thank you. So today's talk is just to give you some feedback on BS 12206. So we'll start with talking about what a standard is, how we review a standard, then we'll look at the standard in 2021 against the original version of it in 2004, and then I'll just make my comments on the difference between the QUALICOAT specification and the British standard, and then we'll have the panel discussion to talk about that in more detail. So what is a standard? Well, it's a document which is established by consensus and approved by a recognised body. So it's basically a committee decision, and on the 12206 what we did was we got together voices from all parts of the industry, so from the pre-treatment, powder and applicator side on our side of the business, to the people who use powder-coated products, so that's the systems houses and the fabricators, to the architects and specifiers, and to clients. So we got together all their voices to produce a standard that they can all stand behind. So just so you're aware, if there's a European standard, it automatically supersedes any national standard for those countries that are subscribing to that European, as members of CEN. So as members of CEN, which is not part of the EU, so we are part of the European Standards Organisation, it's a separate thing to the EU, and we're still members of that. If there's a European designated standard, we are obligated to follow that in the UK, as is every other country, obviously, who uses that specification. So the idea of the standard is not to produce the best quality product, it's to produce a fit-for-purpose product. So you can exceed a standard quite easily, but what you should never go below a standard. So we're looking for a product that is fit for purpose in use, not necessarily one which is the best possible outcome for everybody. Now, just to give you a feel for all the steps that we have to go through when we're reviewing a standard, this is an overview of the development process. Now, I was asked in 2016 to look at this review of BSEN 12206, which was originally a standard in 2004, and every 5 years these standards come up for review. So they normally go through on the nod if nothing needs changing. They're just adopted for another 5 years. The UK from 2009 had been trying to change what was written in 2004. Finally, we got to a position in 2016 where we were able to promote that and to make sure that the Europeans stood behind us as well and approved this as a work item, because you have to have approval and agreement from the whole of the CEN body, and each member country has its own vote on that. So in 2016, the reason we were able to justify this change is because we were finding that the industry as a whole were just ignoring this standard. Basically, you've heard talk today about BS 6496, the old British standard. People were still specifying it and were indeed until 2017, although it should have been withdrawn effectively in 2004. So we needed a standard that was up to date, because 6496, when it was introduced, when it was put together, was back in 1984, and there was no such thing as chrome-free pre-treatments. There were no such thing as QUALICOAT Class 2 super durable powders. There's been all sorts of developments within the industry. So what we've tried to do with our review was to look at what was done in 2004 and update it again to 2016 as was. The whole of that development process, as you can tell from the standard being 2021, takes quite a long time. So it starts with the approval of a work item. So we go to the CEN and say we want to review this standard, so they call that a work item, and then they say, okay, find yourself a working group. So what you have to do is put a call out to the countries of the in CEN and say, please send your experts to us and be on a committee and help us formulate. Now, we found it quite difficult to get that working group together. So what we did in the UK was we put our own subgroup together, and I'm grateful for all the support that we had from the powder manufacturers, from the pre-treatment suppliers and from other applicators and from other independent sources within the UK who helped us put together a framework that we could then take to the CEN working group and say, right, this is what we're going to work on and we're going to make this happen. So once we got that together, that took about 3 years to get together to a form where we actually had a revised standard. That standard then gets sent out to the public via CEN, so it goes to every member country and to each of their organisation. Now the standard organisation in this country is BSI, and each European country has its own version of that. They send this out to them, they send it out to their group that looks at powder coatings or paint finishes, and then they assess what we've done, and then they come back with comments. Now we had 50 comments on our first draft. Fortunately, about 30 of them were purely editorial, so it was quite simple to adjust the specification for them. And then finally, we were able to assess the other 20 and made sure that we either incorporated what they wanted or came up with a suitable argument against them, so that we could then go back with a final draft, which went off to a formal vote, again voted on by all the member countries, and then once they've approved it, we get ratification, and then within 3 months of that, you get your publication, and that was what we got in May 2021. So there was key changes in all the different areas within the specification, within the standard. So I've just got a few slides, one for each of the sort of main areas, and what I feel are the main changes. So on pre-treatment, the first thing we did was we felt that we had to introduce an etch requirement. In the old 2004 version of the standard, it basically says you should clean and pick all the aluminium, and that's it. There's no how much, how long, or anything like that. So we introduced the 1 gram per square metre requirement to give a standard requirement for a minimum to give you the right performance for a good quality coating. We also, in the standard, it said you could use non-chrome pre-treatments. There was no detail about any of them, and indeed pre-anodising as a finish as a pre-treatment wasn't included in the original 2004. So the new standard has the allowance for those, and we tried to make it so that the performance of the pre-treatment system gave you a performance at the end, not actually how you did it, but what the result was important. And we found, and we've done it so that the equivalent performance is the same for all the different pre-treatment systems. So that means that if you do it correctly, whichever pre-treatment system you use, you will get the right result at the end. And that's all we're really interested in. So the specification no longer is a chrome-based one, or wants pre-anodising or wants chrome-free. Any can be used. They're all equal, and they all give the right performance. And we just clarified the corrosion categories for the tests of the natural exposure for non-chrome pre-treatments. There was the original standard held a metal standard as the one you used to define the corrosion categories, and we went away from that to a paint standard, so we're actually looking at the performance of the product, which is pre-treated aluminium with powder on it, not the base aluminium. So the corrosion of that final product is more important than actual corrosion of aluminium. So on the powder, I'll take these actually in reverse order, but so the original standard had 1 year Florida, and that was it. What we introduced was a designation so that the number of years for exposure in that natural weathering could be determined by the specifier or by the person making the powder. So they chose how long they wanted to have it tested for, but they put into it what the performance is and how they can meet that. So they have to meet the minimum performance, and then they tell us how many years they've tested for to achieve that minimum performance. In the same way, on flexibility, it was well known that original powders had a certain flexibility, and that when you increase the durability of the powder, it tended to reduce that flexibility. So what we did was we allowed the powder manufacturers to say I can achieve this many years in Florida with this amount of flexibility, which gives them the opportunity to develop products which are more flexible but equally more durable, which at the time appeared to be not possible but has since been developed. So those manufacturers can now exploit that and say, we have a product which meets this category of this and this category of that. We've also asked that the powder is identified correctly. So that means that on a box of powder, we have asked for all of the constituents parts of the product to be there. So the cure schedules are all there. They must put on the colour, they must put on which durability class it is, what natural weathering class it is. So we've asked them to have that all detailed out onto the product. That was never there before. And finally, on application, we looked at changing the film thickness minimum. In the old standard, it had a requirement for a minimum average with an absolute minimum. So the minimum average was 50, the absolute minimum was 40. In consultation with the industry and people, we realised that a lot of conflict was being caused by people taking readings that were above the absolute minimum, but they were finding them, say, just below the average minimum, and then focusing their inspection on the areas that were below the average, although there might have been other areas on the same piece that were above the average. And so we were getting people saying, I've got this piece, I've measured 5 points, I've got an average of 55, this inspector's come along and he's got an average of 48, it's the same piece of metal, there's nothing below 40 on any of it, why can't I get that accepted? So we decided that it would be simpler for the industry to have an absolute value of that minimum, and we placed it at 40 where it was. We looked at surface appearance, and because we were concerned that the visual inspection distances were getting too far away, we decided that we would look at reducing those for things that we felt would be detriment to the performance of the product. So what we did was we reduced all of the visual inspection distances for items which are detrimental to performance, such as inclusions, scratches, etc., down to 1 metre. But we allowed the longer distance viewing for things which aren't detrimental to performance, but are more a visual thing, such as colour, gloss. So if you look at something from a distance, if you need to look at something which is not going to change the performance of the product, then you're allowed to look at it from further away. So things like, and this is to do with to match the standard to where it was for other products like anodizing, where visual problems such as dye lines aren't going to affect the performance, but they do affect how people look at it. And the final thing we changed was to allow colour to be assessed both visually and colorimetrically, because in the standard it just said, originally in 2004, it just said the colour shall match, but it didn't tell you what a match was, and it didn't tell you how to work out how to match. So we changed that so that it was done that way. So I've just picked out 2 areas that I wanted to say as a comparison of the 2 standards. First of all, the British standard is a standard, or the European standard is a standard for testing the product. It doesn't determine how often those tests need to take place. It is just, these are the tests that you do if you want to determine that your product meets the standard. So the QUALICOAT specification has a requirement for frequency of testing in there. So that is a difference between them. All standards like this are self-policing. So all of the European standards are self-policing. They don't put in, somebody has to come in and check that you're meeting that standard. What you do is say, I'm meeting it, and if you want to check me, please do. What QUALICOAT gives you is a way of independently policing that. So there's a real benefit in that, I think, that you can have an independent person come in and say, these people are producing their work to the British standard. They're not just claiming that, they are actually doing that. And the last thing I think that I would say is that obviously the European standard is European and QUALICOAT is worldwide. And I think that is a benefit to QUALICOAT as well, because if you look at these sorts of standards like EN 1206. In the world, there are different standards for powder coating, and they've not been harmonised together. So to get a worldwide standard is a big achievement. Okay, that's everything I've got to say. Thank you very much.